Open Minds Media. The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Our Reality with Shane Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of deep open-minded conversation. I'm the one they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have somebody that I've been wanting to have on the show for a while now, actually, diving into one phenomenon that I've particularly been fascinated with, and that's schizophrenia, and the possible connections that it may not be exactly how most mainstream science believes that it is, but it might actually be something a little bit more in the spiritual realm. But before we get into anything else today, guys, I have some very, very exciting news to announce. I have finally set up an OMM Encounter Reports hotline, and that phone number is 313-364-1551. And for that, I want to use some of your guys' encounter/experience reports in upcoming shows, one of which is the Reality Report for anybody that's been watching on social media. That is the new show that I announced for Patreon and is going to have some normal episodes dropped onto the normal feed also. But I want to build up not just bizarre stories that I found on the internet, but also some of the stuff from you guys. So, of course, don't forget to report those encounter reports to ommencounterreports@outlook.com, or you guys can always just call in, leave a voicemail at this number. You guys can even text it if you want to, whatever's easiest for you, and let me know what you guys want to do with the experience, because like I said, I would love to use some of these on upcoming shows. But if you're somebody that just wants to have somebody to talk to about these experiences and possibly even have me come out and investigate it, if you're within an area that I can come to and you guys don't want to end the episodes, just let me know beforehand. But of course, I'm going to connect with you guys and make sure it's okay even after you guys report these before they get featured on the show. But I am very excited to announce that, and down in the show description you'll also find that number if you didn't catch it. And if you know anybody else that might want to share some experiences, don't forget to pass it along to a friend. Just a quick piece of news. The next event that I will be at will be Snarly Yow's Cryptid Halloween 3. That'll be happening in West Virginia on October 26th. More information on that is available down in the show description. And the last piece of news and updates, I recently went on a Squatch hike in northern Michigan, uploaded a couple videos onto TikTok about it, also onto YouTube, but I'm going to be doing a little bit more to try to promote a little bit more video content as far as YouTube and TikTok goes. So if you guys don't mind following both of those pages if you haven't already, I would greatly appreciate it. But before we get into the show, just a quick message. This podcast has a strong focus on community engagement, so I encourage all listeners to share their own experiences and research on the show. That said, if you guys have an encounter or experience you guys would like to share on the show or have me investigate, you guys can email me at ommencounterreports@outlook.com. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, you guys can email me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com. Every single thing that I mentioned is all available in the link tree, which is available down in the show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome to the show, Jerry Marzinsky, a licensed psychotherapist. How's it going today?
Going pretty good. Glad to be able to catch up with you, even though it's late.
Oh, yeah. I just got back from a long, busy weekend, getting going a little bit of a vacation and stuff. So I'm always happy to come back and get back into the show. And particularly this one. This is one I've been looking forward to for a while. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to get into as far as the conversation today. But I guess a good spot to get started, and the main reason why I wanted to kind of have you on the show, I guess I won't give too much of the background yet. We'll kind of let it build up a little bit. But for anybody that may not be familiar with your work, what you do, why don't you give them a little bit of a background to it, and then we can build up to why exactly I wanted to have you on the show today.
Well, my name's Jerry Marzinsky. I've been on the front lines of mental health for close to 50 years now. I spent a lot of time studying the thought patterns of schizophrenics and psychotics and criminally insane patients. I've worked in virtually every type of mental health setting in the United States. I've worked in mental health centers. I've worked in hospital emergency rooms. I've been a contractor. I've worked in the state prison, the psychology department of the state prison. I started off my career in one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet. There were 10,000 psychiatric patients there when I got there in Milledgeville, Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, Georgia. I started off believing what I was fed in college and graduate school, and slowly, being on the front lines, piece by piece, saw that what they had fed me in college and graduate school wasn't anywhere near the truth. That the voices were not hallucinations as they said they were. After copious investigation, I found out that these things were entities. They were conscious, thinking, parasitic entities. And that's a long story, but that's where it ended up. And the evidence was just beyond compelling. I have no doubt now that these voices are not hallucinations. They're anything but. Now, the psychiatric mafia wants you to believe that they're hallucinations, and that was started off by a drug company for their own profit, for their own sake, and it was a company called Eli Lilly. So that they came up with this lie. I mean, it was an absolute lie that mental illness is caused by a chemical imbalance of the brain. So they did that in the 1980s after the release of the antidepressant Prozac. The idea of a chemical imbalance was started by Eli Lilly. So Peter Brigham, he's a psychiatrist. In 1991, he wrote the book Toxic Psychiatry. He said the drug company Eli Lilly advanced the chemical imbalance theory as a marketing scheme to sell their new drug Prozac. There was no demonstrable evidence showing that depressed patients had any imbalance, but Lilly ran with it. Before long, psychiatrists and psychiatric patients alike came to identify with the idea that mental disorders are caused by chemical imbalances in the brain. It's one of the first lies I saw when I was working at the state hospital after graduate school. It was the first place I worked. And one of the things I noticed is that the psychiatrist there never, ever gave any kind of test, any kind of objective test to determine what chemicals were out of balance or by how much. And I found that pretty odd. They just went, okay, we're going to start you on this drug, and if that doesn't work, they'll increase the dosage or decrease the dosage or start on another drug or start with a combination of drugs. There was no test. So one day I was curious about that, and I said, well, if you're not given any kind of objective test, how do you know what chemical, what neurotransmitters are out of balance and which are not? He goes, we let the drug companies determine that. They tell us which medicines to use for whatever. And I'm like, what are you talking about, man? I'm thinking, yeah, that's like letting the fox in the hen house. What? I can't believe.
That's one of those things too
that
you don't.
Staring at him.
That's one of those things too that you don't necessarily have a constant because everybody's brain functions a little bit differently. So something might be a little bit different in one person's brain than the other, but it may not necessarily say that something's wrong. It just might be that different people's brains work differently. So using that as a blanket term is a horrifying thing, especially considering the fact that even today we talk about all these mental illnesses and that's always the go-to is it's a chemical imbalance, even though there's no proof or validity to where the start point is for that to be chemically imbalanced.
Yeah, there is no start point. Matter of fact, they not only do not know what chemicals are out of balance, they have no idea what the chemical balance of the brain should be. None. It's a total fabrication. It's a total lie. Yeah. So it's like that's what they were teaching in graduate school. That's what they're teaching in medical schools now, and it's just a marketing ploy for the pharmaceutical industry to make it look like they know what they're doing. They have no idea what they're treating. So coming out of graduate school, it didn't prepare me at all for working at one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet. Nothing in counseling would work with schizophrenics. It was like talking to a frog or something. I mean, they would listen to you, but it wouldn't change their behavior whatsoever. So counseling was a waste of time pretty much with these guys. And back then, in the 70s and 80s, the only thing we had that worked were these drugs. And those drugs were, here's the drug companies, kind of, oh, we spend billions of dollars developing these drugs. That's why we have to charge so much for them. These antipsychotic drugs were discovered in a German, and that was I think it was a German dye factory, and they were taken by the French and purified. So what they were major tranquilizers. So they had no idea why they worked when they came out. They tried to test these phenothiazines in Europe, but the Freudians were in control of psychology and psychiatry in Europe, so they wouldn't let them test in the psychiatric hospitals. So they brought the drug over to the United States and tested it in one of the big psychiatric hospitals over here and found that it knocked these guys silly. I mean, they were just dumbed down. They weren't causing problems. They were walking around like zombies. They were calm. They weren't fighting each other. They weren't biting each other. They weren't attacking the staff. For them, it was a miracle drug. So at that point, psychiatry and neurology were at each other's throats, fighting for dominance. So psychiatry was losing badly. So they clamped onto these drugs as their province, and then started spreading them all over the United States and all the hospitals. So prior to that, the attendants had to wrestle psychiatric patients into straitjackets, and they would tie them in these straitjackets and keep them tied up until they were just tired of struggling against them and wear themselves out. Patients were getting hurt, bones were being broke, noses were being punched out, black eyes. I mean, it was a battle with these psychiatric patients, and they're very strong. When they get upset, they're supernaturally strong.
It's all that adrenaline kicking in.
That. It's not just the adrenaline. There's something else on top of the adrenaline. I watched a 150-pound inmate throw two big guards around the inside of a cell like they were popcorn when he was upset. The guards learn not to pick on schizophrenics. They learn it quickly.
This might be jumping a little bit too far ahead here. Maybe you're kind of building up this a little bit, but one thing that I've always kind of noticed as far as like schizophrenia goes, and the reason why I kind of connect it also with not necessarily being an internal force, but rather something else that's an external force, is the fact of how much it seems to line up with a lot of what people describe as like possession, for example. Hearing different voices, then they have this like superhuman strength. It seems like a lot of the tropes for schizophrenia seem to also be along the lines of a lot of this, I guess, paranormal, demonic type activity is probably the best way to describe it. And it seems like they just kind of use that blanket term where they just don't want to take into consideration there being any type of spiritual factor. They're just looking at it strictly from this is how we explain it, scientific factor. And in turn, by doing that, they end up doing what it seems like a lot of the pharmaceutical industry ends up doing, where rather than actually finding a cure or a root cause of something, they kind of just treat it and blanket it and just try to make it easier for themselves and don't actually get to the root of what's causing the trauma for the patient.
Well, they don't want to get to the root of it. They don't make any money getting to the root of it and curing it. Matter of fact, they cut funding for looking for the cause of schizophrenia down to a dribble. And then they manipulated the statistics to make it look like they were spending 3 times more money than they actually were. They don't want a cause. They're making $14.7 billion a year selling antipsychotic drugs. These drugs cure absolutely nothing. All they do is treat symptoms. They dumb the person down, turn them into a semi-zombie. They cure absolutely nothing. They don't fix anything. Same way with antidepressant drugs. They cure nothing. So these drugs, they don't fix anything. They just treat symptoms. Okay? They're making a fortune doing that.
Just a random side question too, that I've heard this a few times, but I don't know what the validity is to this. But coming from somebody that actually studies this stuff, is it true that once you start taking like an antidepressant, for example, that your brain isn't able to like re-regulate itself afterwards? So it's like if you get off, your brain's never going to go back to the same spot it was originally because your brain becomes dependent on what's being fed into your brain from these pharmaceuticals?
Well, I haven't heard that, but what I have heard is that there's a very nasty withdrawal effect. And in a lot of those antidepressants, they're so horrible that the person doesn't want to even think about getting off of them. Especially with Wellbutrin. It's a withdrawal akin to heroin, headaches, vomiting, terrible side effects from the withdrawal of those drugs. So I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't by design of the drug companies also.
Yeah, I mean, they get you on them in the first place because they're trying to help with people with suicidal thoughts, but then in turn from having that withdraw, it ends up causing these thoughts. So it's like, it's a catch-22. It catches you back into the cycle. If you ever try to get off of it, it pulls you back into that cycle again, like you said, to just keep people in that reoccurring treatment rather than cure.
Well, they don't even stop the suicidal thoughts. Matter of fact, some of the warning labels on the antidepressants warn that they may trigger suicidal thoughts. And now if you look at what's actually happening in the United States, 50,000 people kill themselves in the United States every year. Every year, year after year after year after year. And that's as many that died in the 10 years of the Vietnam War. And a lot of these people that are killing themselves are on antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs. So you look at what's actually happening in all the Western mental health stuff, in all Western psychiatry and psychology. You got more psychiatrists, you got more psychologists in existence now. You got more psychiatric medicines now than at any other time in human history, and we're sicker than we ever have been. The psychiatric hospitals are full to overflowing. The prisons and the mental health patients in the prisons, they're full to overflowing. The mental health centers are full to overflowing. The emergency rooms are full of psychiatric patients. Nobody is getting any better. And they don't want them to get any better. They want them to buy drugs. It feeds the hospitals. It feeds the emergency room. It feeds the doctors. It feeds the psychiatrists. They're not looking for a cure. They don't want anybody getting better. This is pathetic.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. And we are back, so let's hop right in. Have you, at least from your research, obviously the schizophrenia thing seems to be attached to something else, but like depression and any of the other mental illnesses that seem to be pressuring society nowadays, do you feel like all of these things might be linked to external forces or just schizophrenia in particular?
Schizophrenia in particular. Now, and paranoid schizophrenia. Now, what's behind that is trauma. You're not going to, you're seldom find a schizophrenic who has not suffered severe mental, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. So, considering that, look at what's happening on the planet right now. You got 500,000 Ukrainians who have been killed in that stupid war that they lost long ago, funded by the frickin' CIA and the intelligence agencies over in Britain. How many millions of soldiers have been maimed and are suffering trauma from that war? And then you look at what's happened politically. You talk about demonic possession. Look at these. Look at the leaders in the Western world right now. Virtually every single one of them is a lunatic. You look at the patterns that the voices run, and virtually all of them are eaten up with these same patterns. So, there are negative entities on this planet, and they're feeding on all of us, not just the schizophrenics. It's most notable with the schizophrenics, but they're hitting all of us. And when you have a negative, intrusive thought, where do you think that comes from? And we're taught from the time we're kids that every thought that enters our mind belongs to us. That's far from the truth. And these thoughts coming into the mind of schizophrenics are not coming from them. And the schizophrenic patients often ask these voices, who are you? What are you? And they will respond, we are you. They want them to believe that these voices are who they are, that those voices are coming from their mind. And if they listen to them, they're going to get in a lot of trouble. They're going to get in fights. They're going to hurt people. They're going to get in trouble. They're going to sabotage themselves. So there are external forces in this universe, and they become very clear when you study the thinking of schizophrenics. Those voices they hear are not who they are.
When they say that we are you too, it seems like they're talking in multiples, which kind of gets into that whole like legion concept, when it seems like when you're dealing with like demonic possession, they never refer to themselves as a singular. It's always as multiples. So even with people with schizophrenia, it makes me wonder if, I haven't studied it myself, but if they hear multiple voices, I mean, I'm kind of curious if it could be the whole concept that there are multiple things within them and not just one singular being that's trying to manipulate them.
Yeah, it runs the gamut. It goes from 1 to 2 to 3, and some patients have hundreds. And the ones that have hundreds, their chances of recovering are very slim.
And at least diving into this research too, when did it start for you where you chose to kind of dive into this like specifically? Did you interact with a specific patient that kind of pushed you down that path, or was it just like a combination of dealing with different patients throughout different hospitals that it kind of just pushed you down this direction where you wanted to research into this a little bit more?
Well, I was kind of thrown into the cauldron, I guess. So coming up through in undergraduate school, I remember I was taking abnormal psychology, and I was just fascinated by it. But one thing I noticed is they had all these detailed descriptions of all these different mental illnesses, but they didn't have any cures. They didn't have anything about what do you do about these things. And I'm sitting there reading all this stuff and going, wow, what causes this? Why is this happening? Now, I was raised to distrust authority. I mean, from a young age. And that's what I hated most about psychology, because you get into college and they just throw these textbooks at you, said memorize this stuff, and there's no way to tell if it's true or not. The only real class that I had that I could go in there and actually see what they were talking about was experimental psychology, when you go into a rat lab and you run these different schedules with the rats, and you actually can see their behavior change. But otherwise, you're given all these books and memorize them and spit this back on a test. There was no testing it. There was no way to see. And matter of fact, you couldn't get into a psychiatric hospital or a mental health center to test any of that. Go ahead and try. You go to a psychiatric hospital and say, hey, I want to do some studies. They'll go, the hell you are? It's too dangerous. We can't let you in here. We can't take the risk. Mental health center. No, it's privacy issues. We can't let you in here. In my entire career, which spanned probably 45 years working for other mental health agencies, I have never, ever seen a single researcher on the front lines studying mental illness. It's all coming out of the universities. The universities were taken over in, I believe, 1950 by the Standard Oil guy and some of those other millionaires. They made it illegal for doctors to graduate from any medical school unless they studied pharmacological medicine. So it had to be based around pharmacy, had to be based around pills. Everything else they would call quackery. So Tesla Violet Ray was out, naturopathy was out, acupuncture was out. Any other form of treatment for mental illness or anything else was considered illegal. So they took over the medical industry back then, and they still run it now.
It seems like when you dive into like the mind itself, a lot of these I guess, experiments, you could say, seem to be a lot more of like the black budget type stuff. So I'm kind of curious if, when it comes to like actually studying this stuff, like in the mainstream, or at least attempting to, if it's a matter of they kind of just keep everybody away from this stuff because they know that there is something to this, and they kind of try to study it in the dark and just kind of push people away from it. And keeping that whole like indoctrination kind of concept too, you know, if you start proving the fact that there is external forces that are manipulating these people's minds, then it kind of shifts the paradigm for not just like this course of study, but also a bunch of different courses of study. Because if you actually are able to prove the fact that there's these demonic forces, and they, of course, don't want you to go down that path, then at that point, it would start changing stuff in history and science too. So I feel like it's one of those things that they intentionally try to protect it, because as soon as you start proving something with the mind, it can alter so many different other things. So it's just a matter of like keeping everything in one specific place. And if they are studying this stuff, assumably they're probably doing it behind closed doors, like they did with all the MK Ultra and all the other different like mind experiments they've tried to conduct.
I don't think they're studying it at all. You know, in the entire time, 8 years I spent in higher education and graduate school, spirituality wasn't mentioned even once. It was totally ignored. We're spiritual beings, and we're energetic beings. Your spirit leaves your body, you're dead. You're just a sack of, you're just flesh. You just rot into nothing. You know, so how could they ignore the spirit and try to find a cure for something like schizophrenia? Schizophrenia is a spiritual disease. It's not a biochemical imbalance. It's not a genetic thing. I mean, so, you know, when these first phenothiazines came out, for the first 10 years, they had no idea why they worked. They just saw that they would tranquilize these patients and that they were no longer violent. They calmed down. Some of them returned to almost normal functioning. So, you know, it was like psychiatrists grabbed this, and it was like that was their claim to fame. They had no idea why it worked. So that didn't look good. So they had to find some reason. So they started off blaming mothers. Oh, the mothers did something to cause schizophrenia. You know, that went on for like a decade, and then the mothers went, what did we do? I mean, we're being mothers. What did we do? So, you know, you could examine that and see, you know, whatever the mothers were doing. And there's so many mothers and so many different things. I mean, there was nothing there. So what they did is kicked it up out of the province of where the average person could see what's going on. So then they went, oh, it's a genetic disorder. Okay? And so it took probably about a decade before some geneticists started looking into it. And they went, well, we don't see any genetic markers for schizophrenia. We can't find anything. And then so here comes Big Pharma and the psychiatric mafia back with the universities and go, well, it's a bunch of genes. They're all mixed together, and you can't tell what's going on, but we'll find it one day. You know, so, you know, here's the geneticist saying there's nothing there. You know, you can say that all you want. There's nothing there. Okay? So now they're like, well, we don't know. We don't know what causes it. We don't know what causes it. And the honest psychiatrists, and there are some, you ask them what causes schizophrenia, and they'll tell you, we don't know. You know, they have no idea. The rest will tell you, oh, it's a biochemical imbalance. Okay? So, like I said, when I first went to work at the state hospital, I didn't see them giving any tests to determine what was out of balance or by how much. They don't have any test for it. None ever existed. So they have no baseline. You know, they're just like throwing darts at a dartboard and saying, you know, well, I think we'll start with this drug, and that, you know, there is no biochemical imbalance. But yeah, you'll see the advertisements they're putting out for it even now will say, well, it is believed that it's a biochemical imbalance, and they start talking about the serotonin. And within the last couple of months, another research article came out and said it's got nothing to do with serotonin. So it's lie after lie after lie, misconception after misconception after misconception. So here they are proliferating these things upon the whole planet. You know, the whole Western mental health system. They're all singing to the same tune. And the pharmaceutical industries are making a fortune billions of dollars a year selling these antipsychotic and antidepressant drugs. So you look here in the United States, and it costs about $800 a month to stay sane on these drugs, with psychiatrist visits and pharmacy visits and all that. You go across the border to Mexico, which is 60 miles south of where I am now, and you can walk into a pharmacy and you can buy these same psychiatric drugs you're paying $800 a month for here for $75 over the counter in Mexico. A lot of them made by the same company, and they're still making a profit selling them at that rate. You don't need to go see a psychiatrist. These drugs are not abusable. Nobody in their right mind wants to take them. Even people in their crazy mind don't want to take them. Their side effects are awful. They're awful. I got a list of them here somewhere, but they're just terrible drugs. They're not abusable. Nobody in their right mind is going to want to take these drugs. So nobody's going to abuse them because they're terrible. Let me see if I can find the side effects.
We will be right back after this brief commercial break. But just a quick reminder, if you guys want to stay up to date on the show, you guys can always go and follow Inquiries of Our Reality and Open Minds Media on Instagram, Facebook, Discord, YouTube, and TikTok. Now feel free to fast forward through these commercials so we can hop right back into the show. And we are back, so let's get back to it. Just a side note too, while you're looking for the side effects, at least people with schizophrenia, when they take these drugs, does it actually like stop the voices or do anything for them? Or is it more so just make them docile, but they are still experiencing all of the same things? It's just a matter of the fact that they can't like act on it because their body isn't working properly if they've been basically hit with like a form of like a tranquilizer.
It very rarely stops the voices. It will weaken them, but it will not stop them. So, the voices, these are energetic entities. There is no time, there is no space, there is no matter where they're at. They live in a different dimension than we do, but they're right here with us. Okay? So, they're the ones that put these intrusive thoughts in your mind when you're standing on the end of the bridge and you go, I wonder what it would be like to jump. Or you're driving along the highway and you go, what would it be like to turn into oncoming traffic? Or I had one guy write me, he said, well, you're right. I was standing behind my boss the other day and I had this intrusive thought to spit on the back of his head. So they hit us all. They don't just hit the schizophrenics. So what they're doing with these drugs, so if you get a big powerful magnet, that magnetic field is invisible to us. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it, you can't smell it. For all practical purposes, it's invisible to all our senses. We know it's there because the magnet will attract iron or steel. So if you get a bunch of iron filings and you put the iron filings on the magnetic field, you will see an outline of the magnetic field. So since these entities are energetic, they're not physical, pouring psychiatric drugs on them is akin to pouring Thorazine on a magnetic field and expecting it to disappear. It may weaken it if you pile enough on it, but it's not going to get rid of the magnetic field. The cause of schizophrenia is these entities. If you get rid of the voices, all symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia will disappear with them. It's the voices that cause the schizophrenia. It's not a chemical imbalance. It's not a genetic this thing. And yet they still want you to believe that. So now they're writing, experts suspect that schizophrenia happens because of a chemical imbalance, or genetic mutations. I mean, this was taken just, out of the Cleveland Health Clinic just a few months ago. So they're still pushing it, but now they're changing it to suspect. So back to the side effects. Now, these are just side effects of antidepressants. Nausea, weight gain, trouble sleeping, dry mouth, blurred vision, dizziness, anxiety, headache, diarrhea, constipation, sexual problems, fatigue, tremors, increased swelling, lower alcohol tolerance, bleeding, lower sodium levels, vomiting, restlessness, muscle cramps, and seizures. And anxiety drugs. Nausea, diarrhea, constipation, loss of appetite, blurry vision, dizziness, drowsiness, fatigue, dry mouth, agitated restlessness, headaches, sexual dysfunction, sleeping problems, increased blood pressure, stomach aches, sweating, lethargicness, and tremors. And the antipsychotic drugs are all those and more. So the side effects are awful. They're toxic. These are toxic effects of these drugs. So these drugs are poisons. Now with the antipsychotic drugs, they found doing autopsies on long-term mental patients in psychiatric hospitals. When they did those autopsies, they found their brains were shrunk like walnuts, and it was always schizophrenic patients who'd been on antipsychotic drugs for long periods of time. So these researchers published a paper on that, and the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. They went, "Oh no, it's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia doing this," And then the researchers went, "Okay, we'll find out." They started feeding those antipsychotic drugs to mice, rats, and monkeys, and they found the same thing happen. With long-term use, their brains had shrunk. So these antipsychotic drugs are slowly destroying the patient's central nervous system. They're also rotting out their peripheral nervous system. So they're doing more damage than good in the long run. And here's the psychiatrist saying, well, there's no other way to treat schizophrenia. It's a lifelong sentence. You've got to take these drugs for the rest of your life. I don't know how many times I've heard him tell the patients that. That is not true. There are other ways to treat schizophrenia. Some of them work better than others. But it's a spiritual disease, and they haven't looked into that. That's not their province. So looking into this, when I got to the big state psychiatric hospital, nobody was interested in asking schizophrenics what these voices were telling them. It's like, why isn't anybody curious about that?
It's like the elephant in the room. They're just dancing around the main question.
Right. They weren't even asking the main question. So I started asking, and it turned out that I saw a pattern to them that started with. As every single one I asked, and I asked scores of them. I asked hundreds of them. What are these voices telling you? And it took me about a year to figure out how to talk to them, because there is no benefit to them talking about their voices. They upset their parents, they upset their girlfriends, their friends leave them, their parents are upset, their parents drag them in to see a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist drugs them, turns them into semi-zombies. There's no practical benefit to them talking about their voices. So they keep them to themselves. They don't like to be asked about them. Right? And they don't trust anybody who's asking about them either, because the psychiatrist asks, well, how are you doing? You still hearing the voices? And they say, well, yeah, I'm still hearing them. Okay, we'll increase your meds. And they just keep increasing them until they're just, slobbering zombies sometimes. So there is no benefit. So it took a while to get there, to figure out how to question them about them. And what it was is bit by bit, one guy would tell me something and another guy would tell me something months later, until I had a handful of things that I knew about the voices that no other psychs or counselors knew about. And I would tell them, the new ones, I'd say, I know this much about them. I know they do this. I know they do that. I know they act like this. And what else can you tell me? So they were more likely to talk, because they'd say, well, he does know some things that these other guys don't. And they would give me more information. So one of the first patterns I saw was that these voices were consistently and persistently negative. They never said anything good to the patient or about the patient. It was, you're no good, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're rotten, everybody hates you, your parents hate you, your girlfriend's cheating on you, your wife is cheating on you, your husband's cheating on you, people are talking behind your back. It was anything that they could say that would upset these patients. It was always consistently and persistently negative. So after talking to hundreds of them, it was like, that was a consistent pattern. So here's the psychiatric mafia saying, these are hallucinations, the voices are hallucinations, but this was a pattern. And it was a fixed pattern, it was a persistent pattern. You can ask any schizophrenic whether the voices are telling them good things, and they will tell you they don't. So if they're running a pattern, they can't be a hallucination. Hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're just crazy. They're all over the place. There's no predicting them. This is very predictable. So that was the first pattern that I saw. The second one was that they were consistently anti-religious. They resist the victim attending church, reading the Bible, studying the Psalms. They became volatile. And one patient came in and told me that when he read the 23rd Psalm, the voices acted like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. So I'm like, that's odd. Why would a hallucination be anti-religious? So I started printing out the 23rd Psalm and giving it to my schizophrenic patients and said, read this every time the voices come around and come back in a week and tell me what happened. So they did. The voices hated it. They reacted very negatively to the 23rd Psalm. They reacted negatively to the patient going to church. They reacted negatively to the patient trying to read the Bible. They were totally anti-religious. So when I looked into it closer, I found that the voices were very weak. Then they would disappear when the patient walked into church. If they were of moderate strength, they would get louder and they would start mocking the preacher and saying, what a bozo he is. Look at this garbage. He's telling you, he said, Jesus couldn't even save himself. What makes you think he's going to save you? And then if they were very strong, they would just drive the person out of the church completely. So, when I first became suspicious of that, when the chaplain would give these ice cream socials, he'd hold ice cream socials down in the auditorium for the rehab center. And the only people that didn't go were the schizophrenics on my ward. And I noticed that the first time. I said, well, that's odd. And then the second time it happened, I went, well, here it is again. So I started questioning them about why are they staying on the ward? And it was always like, well, I don't believe in God. I prayed to him before and he never helped me. I don't like preachers. I don't like going to church. So there was this anti-religious flavor again. Okay? And the more I talked to these people, the more this came into being another pattern. Okay? So here's two patterns now. So again, they're running patterns. They can't be hallucinations. Third pattern that came about was time after time. They'd tell me after the voices attacked them, they had no energy left. They were totally drained. One patient said that after a night of being attacked by the voices, he felt like he had been digging ditches in the hot sun all day. He didn't have any energy. He couldn't even get up for breakfast. So I started questioning him about that. And I'd ask him, how much energy do you have before the voices come? How much energy do you have after the voices come? Consistently, they would say, I'm drained. After the voices attack, I'm drained. I don't have any energy. So I started doing a little, kind of simple research thing on it. And I found a 1 to 10 scale. I would give them the scale. I said, how much energy do you have before the voices come? They would circle, 7, 8, 9. And then another one would say, how much energy do you have after the voices come? And they'd be down, 3, 4, 5. It was statistically significant. We ran an analysis of variance on it. There was something going on there. So I would ask them. I said, okay, how do you feel after the voices come? Well, I'm drained. So where do you think your energy went? You were just lying in bed all night, tossing and turning. you didn't use it, did you? And you go, no, I didn't use it. Well, where do you think it went? You go, I don't know. Time after time, score one after another. Where did your energy go? You didn't use it. You were sitting around tossing, turning in bed. Where did it go? Well, I don't know. So I would tell him, if you stuck your hand in a fire 1,000 times, and each time the fire burned your hand, or each time your hand was burned, what was burning your hand? They had no trouble saying the fire. If I say, well, these voices have come thousands of times over the years you've been hearing them, and every time they came, your energy level dropped to nothing, where do you think your energy went? I don't know. They were being blocked from seeing that these things were taking their energy. They couldn't see it. And, even after, some of them would go, well, they take it. Some of them would wake up to it, but the rest of them, they wouldn't. And the voices would get very upset when it was pointed out that there was a one-to-one correlation between the patient's energy being gone and their showing up. So here was another consistent pattern. So pattern after pattern began emerging. Now, I only found 3 of these patterns the 7 years I was working at the big psychiatric hospital. I mean, this place was the size of a small city, and it was in the middle of nowhere. So we had to drive 30 miles to Macon to even go to a hamburger shop. There was nothing there.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. But before we get into this commercial break, if anybody is interested in supporting the show or any of the work I do over here, you guys can go and check out the OMM Patreon. Over there is 7-day free trials available for all of the tiers, and it is constantly updating with new shows and different stuff going on. You guys can also go and check out the OMM merch store, constantly getting updated with new designs, not just pertaining to the podcast themselves, but also cryptid, paranormal, and extraterrestrial related designs. And the third way you guys can support the show, if you guys think I deserve it, is that you guys can leave a 5-star review or rating for the show on iTunes or Spotify. And if you guys leave a 5-star review, of course, I will read on the show and give you guys a big shout out. Now let's get to the commercial break so we can hop back in the show. And we are back. So let's hop right in.
So one day I was asking one schizophrenic about his voices, and he got upset, and he went and told one of the psychiatrists. So the next thing I know, the next morning, I'm pulled up in front of this psychiatrist in his office and on the red carpet, and he's ordering me not to ask questions about the voices. He said, they're hallucinations. What you're doing by asking the patients questions about their voices is you're reinforcing the hallucination and you're making the patient worse. I knew that was a bunch of crap right then, but you can't talk back to the psychiatrists. They're arrogant as all get out. So I just kept my mouth shut. I'm like, you're full of it. These things are running patterns. You're not even looking into it. You don't even know what they are. You've never asked a question. But I couldn't say anything to him. So I had to be very careful because that happened twice over the period of time while I was working at the state hospital. It was almost like there was an unwritten law at the state hospital that you don't do anything to upset schizophrenics that you absolutely didn't have to do. And I think that was the result of schizophrenics attacking psychiatrists at a horrendous rate. Psychiatrists were getting beat up by schizophrenics at a rate that was almost equal to that of attendants that were working with them full time on the wards. And that completely puzzled me. I'm like, what are they saying to these people that are getting them beat up when they're only spending 15, 20 minutes a month with them? What are they doing? I had no idea. It was a mystery. So after 7 years, that answer to that finally came. There was one girl who was, she was schizophrenic. She was hearing voices. She was taking her medicines. And while she was taking her medicine, she was doing good. So she was making good grades in cosmetology class. She was able to function. Even though she was hearing the voices, they were weak. They weren't interfering with her learning. She was making good grades. And then one day she went off her medicines again. And they all did that from time to time. It was very strange. It was like, I remember when I first got to that hospital, I was on the bottom floor of a psychiatric unit, and this there was a banister that ran up to the second floor of this unit, and the banister at the top of this it was actually a pipe, a steel pipe that was served as a banister. They bent it to fit the stairwell, but the top of that banister didn't have a cap on it. So here's this maintenance man one day. He's got a grinder and he's cutting the cap off the bottom. So here's these sparks and smoke flying all over the place. It was the most interesting thing going on at the time. So here's all these psychiatric patients watching the light show, all the sparks flying around. So I just walked in there and was watching it with them. I just joined the crowd and was watching the fireworks show. When that cap fell off of that banister, thousands of pills fell out of that banister. They just kept coming out like a waterfall of pills, and they just bounced all over the floor. And I'm looking down at them, and the great majority of them were antipsychotic drugs. And I'm going, each one of those is a vote for a patient to stay insane. Why is that happening? Why are they throwing their medicines down the banister? Why aren't they taking them? Because it was the only thing that would keep them at least halfway sane. They would return to somewhat normal if they stayed on the medications. They wouldn't get in trouble. But here they're throwing them down the banister. They're spitting them in the toilets. They're having to do watch swallows on them to make sure they're taking the pills. So in the psych rehab center I was working at, if they went off their medicines for 3 times, and at that time the only thing we had to keep people sane were those medicines. So if they wouldn't take the medicines, and we had them in vocational training, the chances are they weren't going to take the medicines when they got out either. So we would discharge them. After the 3rd time, we'd say, okay, you're not taking your medicines. You're not going to take them here when they're handed it to you. You're not going to take them when you get out in society and you have to go somewhere to get them. It's not going to happen. So we would discharge them. So this girl that stopped taking her meds, she told her mother, well, they're discharging me. I went off the meds again. And the mother called me. She was virtually begging me, please don't discharge her. I can't do anything with her here. She'll drive me nuts. I can't. There's nothing I can do. So she said, I'll come up there and we'll find out why she's not taking her meds. So I felt bad for her. So I said, okay, I'll hold off on it. Come on up next Friday and we'll talk to her. So that Friday she drove up from South Georgia, which was a long ride for her. And she came to my office and we were sitting in there talking. We called this girl in who stopped taking her meds. And your mother's asking her, why did you go off your meds? And I'm going, yeah, why did you go off your meds? Both of us are, tell us why you went off your meds. And her mother was pleading with her. So finally she said, you won't believe me. I said, well, try me. I've heard some pretty strange things in the 7 years I've been here. I don't think anything you tell me is going to shock me. She says, okay, I'll tell you. The voices were telling me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me. And they were pointing to the side effects of these medications, telling me that was the result of the psychiatrist poisoning me. Now, I've heard that many times before from patients, but I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't sure where it's coming from. But then looking at these side effects, they are toxic side effects. These people are, in effect, being poisoned. These meds are not good for them. They're rotting out their brains. They're rotting out their nervous systems. They're toxic medications. So that also explained why the psychiatrists were getting beat up at the rate they were. The voices were telling these patients that the psychiatrist is poisoning you, and that they were getting them to attack the psychiatrist. Nobody else was being attacked at that kind of rate. Not any of the nurses, not any of the psychologists, not the counselors, not the chaplains. Nobody was being attacked like the psychiatrists were. So that kind of explained a little bit why they didn't want to upset these patients.
Do you think that the voices were telling them that out of self-preservation or out of being maybe the one thing that they were telling them that's truthful?
Well, both, because what those you keep in mind to why these voices were telling them all this negative stuff is because they were feeding off of the negative energy that they generated. So when they're telling them you're no good, you're ugly, you're stupid, you did this, you did that, nobody likes you, the people are laughing behind your back, they're mocking you. All of that is to generate that negative emotional energy, and then that energy disappears. So they're doing to us what we do to cows. You put the cow out in the pasture, he feeds on grass, he makes milk, we bring him in, we isolate him, we milk him, put him back out in the pasture again. That's exactly what they're doing to us, especially the schizophrenics, because they have much more control over the schizophrenics.
Why do you think it is that they have more control over the schizophrenics? Is it simply just because they've been through that trauma and they have this ability to possibly somewhat like separate themselves mentally, so it kind of gives them like this doorway? Or just at least from your research, do you have anything that you believe might be the reason why?
Well, first of all, it's the trauma, the various types of trauma I told you about. So these things are like sharks swimming in the ocean. They smell blood. They head toward the blood. So these things head toward those who are psychologically or psychiatrically wounded. They can smell that negative energy. So they go in there and they pour gas on the fire and to make it worse. And so, they start with these intrusive thoughts. Now, the biggest battle a schizophrenic is going to have is trying to figure out whether those thoughts belong to them or whether they're coming in from somewhere else. But we all believe that because we experience thoughts in our mind, in our head, that anything that pops into our head is our thoughts. We generated it somehow and it belongs to us. But they've never found a thought generator in the mind. They've never been able to extract a thought from the mind. They've never found a thought in there. They come in from the outside. So Emanuel Swedenborg, a Christian mystic who lived some 300 years ago, he's like one of the top scientists of his day. He said that none of your thoughts belong to you. They either come in from heaven or they come in from hell. But the ones who come in from hell, they talk to you. They'll speak to you. They'll barge in there. They have no respect for your sovereignty. The ones that come in from heaven, you choose. So your brain is like a radio. It's working at a certain frequency. It attracts a certain frequency of thought. So if you were physically, sexually, emotionally tortured and traumatized, you're functioning at a very low frequency, right? Because you have a very poor concept of yourself from those traumas. So that frequency is attracting these things. Then they start putting thoughts in your head, and if you believe those are your thoughts, then you start reacting to them as if they're your thoughts. So you get a schizophrenic whose voices are telling him that the psychiatrist is poisoning him with these meds and to attack the psychiatrist. And then they go off and they attack the psychiatrist, or they attack a guard because the voices are telling them the guard is doing something to them, or some people that are laughing on a corner, they attack these people out of nowhere because they believe that they're laughing at them. So what these things want you to do is believe that these negative thoughts that are coming into your mind belong to you. And then they start pushing aside who you really are and they start taking over. And once they get a certain amount of control, then they control what you do, what you say, what you think. And they tell you to do rotten, stupid things that get you in trouble and generate more of this negative emotional energy that they feed on. So we are their food. They give us their minds.
Say, I just got to point out again how much this parallels what we already are fully aware of when it comes to like possession, for example. And I'm sure that a lot of people like to try to chalk up the fact that possession is schizophrenia, but honestly, I think we're talking about the same thing here more often than not. Coming from, of course, the spiritual, something else taking control side, not the, this is completely something made up in somebody's head side.
Well, possession is more like when they already have control. They possess you. All this other stuff is more interference. There's schizophrenics out there working as nurses. I know two of them now, that I'm working with in my private practice. They're hearing voices, and they're working as nurses. They know that the voices are not them. Okay? So they can isolate them and function without their interfering with what they're doing. So one of the biggest battles a schizophrenic is going to have is to determine, which voices belong to them and their good side, and which are the schizophrenics, which are the entity's voices. And one of the main ways of telling is by their intent. The intent of these voices is always consistently negative. And if they do say something positive, it may be a half-truth to get them to believe it. They want to get their trust, and they want permission to be there. So a lot of times these voices will say, well, I'm a master from another dimension. I can tell you spiritual things. I can help you out. I can tell you things that you don't know. And they can. They would tell meth addicts in the prison, they would tell them where to be and when to be there to get more meth. And a stranger would show up with meth. They tell them which houses to rob, generally where the money was kept, and they would tell them when the people in the house were up. They'd tell them when to get out. They'd tell them where to go hide. So they'd tell them things that they normally wouldn't know.
That's like a double up one too when you include meth too, because even people that don't have schizophrenia, it seems to be a common thing that when people go off on the deep end as far as like getting aggressive when they're on meth and stuff, it seems like when you actually sit down and talk to these people, more often than not, they say that there was demons that were telling them to do this stuff. So there's another commonality between meth, but if you combine schizophrenia with the meth, it's like, one, you already have these voices coming in, and on the second side of it, again, you have these people that are claiming that demons are talking to them while they're on meth too.
Yeah. Now, meth is one of the most dangerous drugs there are. I saw more prisoners who had went psychotic on meth than any other drug. So they start out using it and they feel like Superman. They feel great. They're processing things. They're getting things done. They feel like Superman. It feels great. And then they start hearing voices. And they go, oh, well, that's just a hallucination. When I come down, they'll go away. And they do. So that might happen 10, 20, 50 times. And then one day, they don't go away. They're there permanently. And they are now as psychotic as any of the psychotics in the state hospital. And the voices don't go away.
So from your research too, then, have you kind of noticed that it seems like meth ends up leading to people having schizophrenia? Like it's a common thing that ends up happening?
Yeah, very much so. The prison is full of meth addicts that are psychotic. Full of them.
And then as far as like people that have schizophrenia that start getting into like the really deep end, like aggressive side versus like the people that are functional with it, have you noticed like any commonalities that seem to cause people to get to that overly aggressive side other than possibly like meth use?
Well, they believe that the voices are them, and that whatever they're reacting against is what the voices are telling them. So the voices misinterpret things that are happening in the environment. So, the schizophrenic may be walking down the sidewalk, and all of a sudden these guys crack a joke and they all start laughing. The voices tell them they're laughing at you. Go knock their blocks off. And they attack them out of nowhere. They believe the voice is who they are, and that's exactly what the voices want them to believe. If they believe who they are, that the voices are who they are, then they start becoming the voices.
I mean, that just shows how far they end up getting pushed into believing that these voices are themselves, because I mean, there's of course like the spare the moment crimes, where somebody might shoot somebody or something, but then of course there's the very violent crimes that are linked with a lot of schizophrenia, where people will like, end up like removing body parts or stabbing a significant more times than it actually takes to actually kill somebody. Like when you get into that end, like that's
possession.
Yes, that is almost like full possession at that point, because I feel like you would still have something in your head that tells you like logically that this isn't something that you should morally be doing. So that just shows like how far in depth you are into this thing of believing that these voices are you, if you're actually willing to put aside your morals and your the things that you've learned through life that you know that this is not okay according to society, but you push that all to the side in order to commit these acts that, again, you believe are you.
You don't push them to the side; they're overrun. They're like it's like a tsunami. They're overrun. They're just overpowered.
Inquiries of All Reality will be back after this brief commercial break, but just a quick reminder, don't forget to go and check out the awesome sponsors of the show, I Know Squatch, Cryptoteology, Snarly Owl Natural Products, Organite, Dimension Devices, and Big Ape Threads. More information and discounts for those are all available down in the show description. Now feel free to fast forward through these commercials so we can hop right back into the show. And we are back, so let's get back to it.
Of course, just some of the people that you've talked to, just out of curiosity, if you're okay with getting into it, like the people that have committed these acts, do you know in particular, like what the thing said to them that caused them to say this, like the exact line? Like, I'm kind of curious, like where their mental state is when they get pushed to this point.
Well, I have a poem here I told you about earlier. It's written by a psychotic killer. He shot 3 people and killed them, and he got his girlfriend, he cut her up into little pieces, and they still haven't found her body. So I can read this poem to you, and you can get some insight into what's going on in this guy's head. He's on a maximum security unit in Colorado right now in isolation. He's probably not going to get out for the rest of his life. So he wrote this poem and sent it to his mother. He said, "There's a monster that lives in my head. This monster is real. It's not under my bed. My monster tells me things to do." So here's the voices telling him what to do. It tells me sometimes when the news is new. So it's telling him things. My monster is crying as it spent all the years drowning out my courage and disposing my fears. My monster is strong. That's what I like to think. My monster is coming when it's time to drink. So the monster are his voices. And what he's saying here is that when he drinks, it gets out of control. My monster is ready. My monster is strong. Okay? They get abnormally strong when they get angry. I mean, abnormally strong. It's I can tell you a story that they become supernaturally strong. So he says, my monster is ready, my monster is strong. What will I do when my monster is gone? Okay, so they rely on these voices to fight in the prisons. Okay, I had one prisoner tell me that when he gets upset and gets into a fight, he's not the one who's fighting. The voices are fighting. They take him over and they do the fighting for him. And he hasn't lost the fight.
Is it like they tell him like how to fight, or they like physically completely take over his body where he has no control over it? They pretty well
physically take over the body and just give them abnormal strength. Just supernatural strength. He said, my monster will never leave. That is his plan. So he knows this thing is never going to leave him. It overwhelms me when I'm making a stand. So here he's saying, when I'm trying to stand up against him, he overwhelms me. I don't have any power over him. There is a monster inside of me. I thought I was strong. How could this be? My monster has a name. My monster has a name too. He walks in the dark whispering Yazoo. I don't know what that means. My monster is watching me. So he's saying it's observing him. He won't tell me his name. My monster is the shadows you cannot see. His heart is heavy. He plays for the game. My monster is aware. He wants to be monster. He's as blood from a lake. His bond is with me. Now, monster. He has nothing else to do. My monster is aware. So the monster are his voices. They took him over to shoot those 3 guys, the drug addicts, and they took him over when he murdered his girlfriend.
You said that in that poem that he walks around saying Yazoo. I wonder if that has something to do with anything. Like that might be this being's name, or I don't know. I feel like there's some kind of like meaning to that.
I don't know. It seems like, it just makes no sense, and he might have put it in there to, like, because it doesn't make any sense, but it rhymes. I don't know. I don't know what he means by that.
See, and if he's one of those people that this thing will physically like take him over too, when people write poems like this, I'm kind of curious if it's actually them writing it, or if it might also be the thing attached to them that might be one helping him to write it or writing it to begin with.
No, I think he was writing it about the monster. So he wrote it about this monster that was controlling him.
Have you noticed that, like, talking to these patients or anything like that, that it seems like these things fight for information like this, like even these like little poems and stuff? Like, have you had any experiences where when somebody tries to like write a poem or try to like do anything to try to bring out something, like to let people know about what's happening, that these things will fight back against them to try to make it so that the outside world knows as little of them as possible?
That's consistent. That's constant. They give them headaches. Their throat tightens up. They have they get stomach aches. They don't want them talking about these things. And the voices will actually tell them, if you talk about us, nobody's going to believe you, and they're going to lock you up in a psychiatric hospital. And unfortunately, that's what happens most of the time. They do not want people talking about them. They don't want the schizophrenic telling anybody about them.
Have you ever been in a situation where you've kind of tried to like press to try to get a little bit more information and they seem like they start kind of getting resilient towards you? And if so, like what was your experience dealing with that?
Well, I was pretty good about getting information because the way I was raised, I was always pushing the limits. And if you broke the limit, the punishment was pretty severe. So I was pretty good at pushing right up to the edge of an explosion and then backing off. So I guess I was prepared for what I was doing. But when I was working in the emergency rooms, I spent the last 10 years of my career doing psych crisis and hospital emergency rooms all over Tucson. And one thing I noticed is that the hospitals didn't want you working with these patients in the emergency room. They just wanted you getting them out. That's all they were concerned with. Get them out of the emergency room as quick as possible and make beds open for medical patients that we know how to treat. The doctors didn't like dealing with psychiatric patients because they didn't know what to do with them. So they'd ship them over to the psychiatrists who made them believe that they were the only ones who knew enough about psychiatric medicine to treat these people. So my job there was to either send them to a mental health center if they weren't an imminent threat to themselves or others, to release them. If they were a threat to themselves or others, to get them admitted. But most of the ones that came in there were looking for help, and they wouldn't even prescribe them drugs. They'd say, well, we can't follow up with the side effects. If something goes wrong, we'll be held liable. So they got out of it on those grounds. So knowing what I knew, it was like, what could I tell these people that would help them the most? Given that I was going to have to let them go because they didn't meet the criteria for admission. But yeah, they were psychotic. But if they weren't going to hurt anybody, they weren't going to hurt themselves, they weren't going to be admitted. It just wasn't going to happen. That's their rules. No matter how crazy the guy is. If he doesn't pose a threat to himself or others, they're not going to put him in. They'll release him back to the street if they have to. So, very brutal system. And, so one of the first things they need to know is that the voices aren't who they are. That they are coming from the outside. They're not their thoughts. If a schizophrenic is going to recover, he has to know that. Has to be able to tell the difference between his own thoughts and the thoughts that are coming in from the outside, the voices. And one of the ways to tell that is by the intent. The intent of the voices is very different from the intent of the patient. Patient lots of times doesn't want to hurt anybody. He doesn't want to rob houses. He doesn't want to do all this bad stuff to sabotage himself. It's not his intent. It's the intent of the voices. The second thing is that they're parasites, that they're feeding off them. So if you had a big leech on your arm right now, you wouldn't just sit there and watch it, would you? You'd try to get it off. So for the patient to learn that these things are parasites is very important, because they have to realize that it's not them. Because how can you fight against yourself? So here's the psychiatrist telling them, oh, it's your mind is broken. There's nothing you can do about it except take these meds. You're crazy. This is a life sentence. There's nothing you can do. You're broken. So if they believe that, then there's nothing they can do. They're gutted. It's like they're hamstrung. They can't fight back against the voices. They think it's them. How can you fight back against yourself? There's things you can do to fight back against these voices. There's a lot of things you can do to fight back against them. But by psychiatry telling people this lie, they're making them dependent on psychiatry for the rest of their lives. All you can do is come to us and get these toxic drugs. You have no other hope. It's like Dante's Inferno, where they say, all who walk beyond this point give up all hope. It's disgusting. It's just absolutely disgusting. So if they realize that these voices are not who they are, and that they are parasites and that they mean them no good, then they can start fighting back against them. And there's a number of ways they can do that. The 23rd Psalm, the voices hate the 23rd Psalm. They hate Psalm 91. So I would tell the patients to do all this stuff that the voices hated. One of the biggest things is the lie program. So while I was working in the prison, all these weird things started happening while I was working with psychotics. And I was working with one lady who was a prison reform worker. And I fell in with her. And since I couldn't do anything against the system I was working in because they would fire me, I was helping her attack the Alabama prison system, which are run by a bunch of Neanderthals. I mean, they were much worse than our prison system. So I would feed her information about how best to attack the administration in the Alabama system and drive them crazy. And she would do that. And then one day, I mean, this was 10 years after I was working with her. One day I started talking to her about some strange things that were happening to me while I was working with schizophrenics. Some strange things I was hearing. And after 10 years of working with her, she goes, I know all that. I know about all that. I said, well, how do you know about that? She's one of the most spiritual people I've ever met. She said, well, when I was a young woman, they were attacking me, so they almost killed me. And I'm like, you're kidding. I didn't believe it. Took her. That's how strong the stigma is. And she didn't tell me that for 10 years. And so I started hammering her with questions that only somebody who was hearing schizophrenics or hearing the voices would know the answers to. And bam, 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 she's right there. Bam, bam, she got them all right. I'm like, I can't believe it. She couldn't answer those questions if she didn't know, if she hadn't been there. So we started talking to one another. And then after a while, we went, well, we need to write a book about what these voices are so people know, so that they're aware. And so we got together, and it took us 2 years to write this book, An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind. Sherry Sweeney was my co-author. And we wrote this together. So she had been through the experience, and I had been working with these guys for decades. You can get this book on our website at jerrymarzinsky.com, or it's available on Amazon. And we sat down and we wrote this book, for people who are hearing voices or family members who are hearing voices. Their family members are hearing voices. And this tells how we came to the conclusions that these things were actually evil spirits or demons, and not auditory hallucinations as a psychiatric mafia would like you to believe.
Hold tight, guys. This is the last break, so stay tuned.
And we are back, so let's hop right in. Kind of starting to wrap up towards the end, and I'd definitely love to have you come back on at some point, because I feel like this is one of those things that's continuous research, that you always have new stuff kind of coming out about it and everything. So, of course, you already mentioned where to pick up your book and everything at, and before we start wrapping up towards the end, I always like to do words of wisdom, and I know that you were kind of speaking some words of wisdom as to how somebody can counterbalance this and actually try to start the fight to be able to regain themselves again. But if there was any other words of wisdom you could bestow on the listeners, what might it be?
Well, I think number one, you can go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com and go to articles. Under articles, you will find a whole list of 23 of these patterns that these voices run. So those patterns are equivalent to the iron filings in a jar in a magnetic field. They are the operational definition of these voices. It's how they behave, So it's what the voices are, how they operate. The other two things I'd like to point out is that they're not the thoughts of the schizophrenic. They're coming from outside. They're invaders. They're parasites. They want to upset you, and that's their only goal. They absolutely hate the human race. They attack us all. Schizophrenics worse than others. They're more visible with schizophrenics than they are in other people. But every negative, intrusive thought that goes into your mind is coming in there from them. Those aren't your thoughts. So you get this nasty thought to do something that you normally would never do. That's them. What's happening in the world right now, all these wars going on, all these killings, all these lunatics running the Western world. I mean, look at all the misery they're causing right now. These things are it's a hog trough for them right now. People need to wake up to their existence, because you can't fight something you don't understand and you don't know about. Like I said, they hit us all.
Sooner people realize that the world is just as much spiritual as it is scientific, the better off they're going to be in being able to understand a lot more things in this world that we're just trying to cover blanket terms on and not actually do any of the real research into, such as almost everything that we've talked about today.
That's right. I mean, this is a spiritual battle. This is not a medical, psychiatric, anything. This is a spiritual battle.
And it's only going to keep building up until we actually make the front to actually realize what's happening and actually starting to push back against the spiritual war that's happening. And it's getting to the point where it's almost undeniable for everybody. It's just a matter of people waking up one at a time. But hopefully we get to a point where we actually start pushing back against all these spiritual forces and actually make it so that hopefully the world's mental illness issue will start to deplete and we'll all get to a good point universally for everybody.
I got a whole lot more information about these things also on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. Just go there, go to articles. There's testimonials there. There's a blog there. There's a whole lot more information on that website.
And if anybody was interested in contacting you specifically to possibly talk to you about their experiences dealing with schizophrenia, or if they have a family member or something that might want to talk to you about that might have it, would your website also be a good place to contact you for stuff like that?
Yes. You can go there. I'm working with something called the MESA energy system, which was it's a energetic psychotherapy. It's very different than any other kind of psychotherapy. It's not a talk therapy. It works with energy. So anybody who has been traumatized and has psychological effects of that trauma, we can dissolve that trauma in less than an hour. All negative psychological effects of that trauma will be gone in an hour. I've never seen anything like it in the 50 years I've been working in mental health. It's the most effective psychotherapy I've ever seen. And it's the results are permanent. It's not like when you talk over some trauma that you have and you go over it and over and over it, and then 2 weeks later it's still there. I mean, it actually gets rid of it. And so it actually cures most psychological problems and works better than medications. So you can sign up for that on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com also.
Well, I really, really praise your work. I'm glad that there's people out there that are actually starting to connect science with the spiritual aspects of our reality. So I'm really looking forward to see where your work goes, and I'm really hoping that you get to a point where you kind of have this as like a complete science, where you have it completely figured out, and it makes it so that in the future it will be easier for people with schizophrenia to be able to deal with stuff. But again, you have to have that person that, you know, does the groundbreaking research in order to make it so that they pave the way for people to go along this path and actually do this research properly.
Well, they go there and look at that list of patterns, they can see it for themselves. It's right there in front of their eyes.
And I really appreciate you making the time to come on today. Again, looking forward to hopefully we can cover this again at some point in the future. And again, I praise your work, and I'm really looking forward to where it goes in the future.
Okay, thank you for having me.
If you guys enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave that 5-star review. And if anyone would like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can email me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys can get a hold of me through social media, Instagram or Facebook. Instagram is the one that I'm most active on, of course. Or you guys can get a hold of me through the submission forms, which are available on the link tree. The first one is to contact me, and the other one is to report an encounter. So don't forget to report those encounters to OMM-encounterreports@outlook.com. And every single thing that I mentioned throughout the show is all available on the link tree, which is available down in the show description. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. I hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.